Ms. Love is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I've heard a little bit of consternation about this rule from the banks in my state, who don't think that they're best positioned or the best positioned entity to gather this due diligence. And they wonder why this due diligence isn't conducted by the various states' corporation departments which register the business. On the other hand, banks have already been forced to develop extensive FinCEN compliance procedures, and this would seem to just add new wrinkles to those existing procedures. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the relative merits of having banks conduct this particular form of due diligence. The burden has to fall somewhere, but I guess I'm just trying to figure out why the banking institution has to be the place where it goes. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. Well, I mean, the CDD rule is actually broader than just beneficial ownership. It involves an obligation to know the customer and monitor for suspicious activity. And to do that, you actually have to know who you're monitoring. So the question is, when you start with who the beneficial owners are, is that something the bank should have to do and each bank do potentially for the same customer over time? Or is that something that just should be collected as the legislation would intend at the outset of the formation of that company? I think banks would tell you they're not trying to avoid their CDD requirements, but it certainly would be much more efficient and probably more accurate if they could just draw on a database. I think the draft legislation envisions FinCEN, and just go to that database and say, okay, here are the beneficial owners of this company, and that's who I'm going to monitor for suspicious activity.
Ms. Martinez, what kind of resources does an institution need to devote this additional rule, and how does this affect cost to the institutions?
So I talked about this in my opening statement. Just for IBC, we spent 2,912 hours just designing and testing all of our programs and our policies. And it's taken us about 7,800 hours to train our employees on this new rule. And this is an ongoing effort because there's still not enough clarity.
Right.
I would like to address your point on why the burden is on the banks and not on the states. I'm in Laredo, Texas, which is on the border of US and Mexico, and I'll just use Mexico as an example. I'm not saying or advocating that this is what we should do, but just as an example of what Mexico does, and they've done this for many, many years. Every state in Mexico is required to register businesses, and financial institutions can rely on that information, and that beneficial ownership information is at 1% and above. Okay. And if there's a change to that company structure, there's a formal federal process that the company has to go to register those changes. Okay. So I think we should be partners with the states, and we shouldn't bear the entire burden.
Instead of trying to do two separate. Okay. So what areas should FinCEN and the regulators be working on to address the, you talked about clear understanding, and that clearly is an issue. So what do you think the areas should FinCEN focus on so that we can address that first and foremost? Because that, I can see already using resources on trying to figure out what information, clear direction on what to do, so.
I think there's two that come to my mind right away. And the first one is this issue with the auto-renewable CDs. So if you're a business customer and you bank with 4 different banks in your city, and you have 4 different CDs that all auto-renew at a different time, you're going to be required by your financial institution to provide beneficial ownership information the first time that CD renews after May the 1st. So 4 different beneficial ownership attestations will need to be provided. So if you're a larger business and you've got 4 certificates of deposits and 4 checking accounts, and then you have a change to your organizational structure, now you've got to go to 4 different banks to make those changes. And that is, I think, a burden on our small businesses that are not exempt by this regulation.
Okay, thank you. And on the flip side, what action should FinCEN and regulators take to ensure financial institutions aren't over-collecting information? I mean, you're thinking about different information that has to happen very quickly. You've got different entities. How do we ensure that there's not over-collecting?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think we should all ask FinCEN that question. The problem is also that not only are all the financial institutions having to collect all this information, but it's not going to be used unless we receive a subpoena. and there's nothing to verify it against. Yes, there's verification for identification of the beneficial owners, but there's no corporate document that banks have to verify the percentage of ownership that the customer is attesting to. So how valuable will that information even be to law enforcement?
Very insightful. Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The young lady's time has expired. With that, we go with the gentleman from